He found it on a Tuesday morning, and for the longest time afterward I could not have told you what day it was, what month, what season, whether the sun was out or the rain was coming in sideways across the valley the way it does in County Wicklow when the weather turns its back on you. All of that had gone. There was only the thermos cap. A small thing, a simple thing, a twist of stainless steel with a rubber gasket around the rim, resting on the top rail of the old boundary fence like someone had set it there with great care and walked away. I stood at the kitchen window with my mug of tea going cold in my hand, and I looked at it for a very long time. My sheepdog Finn sat beside the fence below, perfectly still, the way he only sits when he is waiting for something he already knows is coming. I had not put that cap there. I had not been out to the fence in 3 days. And my grandson Connor had left for the Powerscourt estate before 8 that morning, well before I had woken. So who had set it there, and when, and why? I turned that question over in my mind, the way a stonemason turns a piece of granite, looking for the grain, looking for the line where it wants to break. Let me stop here a moment before I go any further with this, because I want to ask you something. If you're listening to this tonight, wherever you are in the world, would you do me a favor and tell me where that is? What town? What country? Is it late where you are, or is it only the middle of the afternoon and you are listening while you drive? Put it in the comments below, because I read every one of them, and I want to know who is sitting with me while I tell you this. Leave a like if you are with me so far. And subscribe if you have not yet, because there is a new story here every single day. All right, let me take you back to Ashford. My name is Declan O'Sullivan. I am 74 years old, and I have lived on this land, or land continuous with this land, for every one of those years, except for a span of roughly 11 years in the middle when I was working across 3 counties as a journeyman stonemason and sleeping in lodgings that smelled of damp and boiled cabbage. I came back to this cottage when my father passed and left it to me, and I have not left it since except to go into the village or down to Wicklow town for supplies, or in the years when my knees still cooperated, up into the hills above Roundwood where the heather turns purple in late summer and the wind comes at you straight from the mountains without anything to slow it down first. The cottage is stone, which you would expect from a stonemason, though I can tell you that a man who works stone all his life is often the last one to attend to the stone of his own house, the way a cobbler's children go barefoot. I did attend to it eventually. I repointed every joint, relaid the threshold, reset the lintels above the 2 front windows, and built the boundary fence myself back in 1983 with my brother Padraig helping on the corners. That fence has stood since then, through every winter Wicklow could put at it, and Wicklow put some fierce winters at a fence. My wife Bridget lived in this cottage with me for 41 years. She passed 4 years ago in the month of February, which is the cruelest month for that sort of loss, in my opinion. Because February in County Wicklow has nothing in it to comfort you. No color, no warmth, no particular reason to get up before the light. The cottage without her in it is a different kind of quiet than it was with her, and there is no way to explain that difference to someone who has not experienced it, so I will not try. What I will tell you is that I have learned to live inside that quiet, the way you learn to live inside a coat that does not quite fit right, adjusting, shrugging, doing what needs doing. My grandson Connor came to stay with me in March of this year. He is 31, my daughter Siobhan's boy, a landscape architect who had taken on a contract to oversee the restoration of the gardens on several historic properties in the county. Powerscourt, a smaller private estate above Ashford, and an old domain wall project near Rathnew that I could have told him something about from a professional standpoint if he had cared to ask. He is a good young man, Connor. Quiet in the way that the best of that generation can be quiet, which is to say that his silence means he is thinking rather than that he has nothing to say. He had his mother's dark eyes, and his grandfather's habit of standing at windows and looking at things for longer than most people consider it necessary to look. He made proper tea, which I considered essential, and he did not play music at volumes that rattled the crockery, which I also considered essential. We had found an easy rhythm inside the first week. The Sunday it began was a wet one. Not violently wet, not the kind of rain that comes in off the Irish Sea and makes you question the fundamental wisdom of living on this island, but a steady gray drizzle that had been going since the previous night and showed no interest in stopping. I had made porridge, and Connor had eaten it without complaint, which was another point in his favor, and we were sitting at the kitchen table with the second pot of tea between us and the windows running with fine water and the hills above the valley invisible in the cloud. Finn was on his mat by the range. The turf was smoldering. It was, by any reasonable measure, a fine morning for staying where you were. Connor had been looking toward the fence for a minute or two, the way I had noticed him doing before, and then he asked me the question that set all of this in motion. He asked it in an unusually thoughtful voice, with a particular quality of carefulness that I only recognized for what it was later, when I understood what he had already been sitting with. "Grandad," he said, "have you noticed that gentleman who comes every night and stands by the fence?" I turned toward the window. The field on the other side of the fence was empty. The grass was flat and wet and uniformly gray in the morning light. The fence posts stood where they had always stood. No one was there. I smiled. I told him he must have seen a fence post in the dark, or perhaps someone walking the old lane that runs along the far edge of the field, which people sometimes do in the evenings with dogs. He nodded slowly, did not argue, did not say anything further, and I thought no more about it until that evening, when I found myself standing at the kitchen window in the dark, looking out at the fence, without any clear understanding of why I had walked to the window in the first place. The field was empty. Finn was at my side. And still I stood there for longer than I could account for, with a feeling I would not have been able to name. I am going to tell you this story from the beginning, the way a thing like this deserves to be told, which means I will take my time with it. I have been a stonemason most of my working life, and I can tell you that the first thing you learn in that trade is that you do not rush the setting. You lay the stone, you pack the mortar, and then you wait. The mortar needs its time. You cannot force it. A wall built in a hurry is a wall that falls, and in my experience, the same is true of the truth. It needs its time to set. Let me tell you about the fence first, because the fence matters more than it might seem to matter. I built it in the summer of 1983, which was a good summer by Wicklow standards, meaning it rained only about half the time instead of the usual proportions. My brother Padraig was 39 that year, and I was 32, and we were both fit and strong from years of working stone. And we put that fence up in 4 days of mornings before the afternoon heat came on. The two of us digging the post holes and tamping the gravel and setting the rails, while Bridget brought us out sandwiches and tea at 11:30 and told us we were doing it wrong. We were not doing it wrong, but that was Bridget's way of showing affection, and both Padraig and I understood it as such and did not take offense. She stood there in her green cardigan with her hair pulled back and told us the corner post was not plumb, and Padraig held his level against it and showed her it was perfect, and she said the level was probably off and went back inside. That fence has been standing for over 40 years, and every post is still plumb, and every rail is still level. And wherever Bridget is now, I hope she has found a way to concede the point. Padraig passed in 2009, a heart attack sudden in his own driveway on a January morning. He was 65. He had a good life, a long marriage, 3 children who turned out well. I still think about that fence corner when the year turns cold. The field on the far side of the fence belongs to a family named Brennan, who have not farmed it seriously in 15 years. They keep a few cattle on it in the summer months, and otherwise leave it to the grass and the rabbits and the birds. It is not exceptional land. A gentle slope toward the lower edge, a stand of ash trees on the eastern boundary, a small depression in the middle that holds water after heavy rain and draws the lapwings in spring. I have looked at the field out of my kitchen window for more than 40 years, and I know every feature of it the way you know a face you have been looking at all your life. I had never, to my knowledge, seen anyone standing at the fence at night, but Connor had. What I would learn, slowly, over the following days and then weeks, was that he had seen this person on 4 separate evenings before he said anything to me about it. He had been returning from the Powerscourt site after long days of walking the grounds and consulting with the estate managers, coming back to the cottage in the early evening dark, and on each occasion he had noticed a figure standing on the far side of the fence at the corner post, the same corner where Padraig and I had had the argument about the level with Bridget all those years ago. The figure stood quietly for perhaps 5 or 10 minutes, and then walked back across the field toward the lane. Never came closer, never made a sound that Connor could hear from the distance of the lane. Simply stood, and then left. Connor had thought about mentioning it on the first evening and decided not to. On the second and third evenings, he had watched more carefully and confirmed that it was the same man, same height, same manner of standing, same direction of departure. On the fourth evening, he had seen the thermos cap being placed on the rail, though he had not been close enough to see the man's face clearly in the dark. On the morning he finally asked me the question, he had been carrying all of this for 4 days on his own. That is a particular kind of patience, and I recognized it as such when I eventually understood the full sequence of events. But that morning, I only smiled and said something about fence posts and shadows, and Connor nodded and returned to his tea, and the day went on around us without revealing anything further. It was Finn who changed how I thought about it. That first evening after Connor's question, I went to bed at my usual hour, which is 10:30, and Finn ordinarily follows me up the stairs and settles in the doorway of the bedroom the way he has done since he was a young dog. That evening he did not come upstairs. I heard him on the flags below, moving to the door and back, once, twice, and then settling into a quiet that had a particular texture to it. Not sleeping quiet, waiting quiet. I have known Finn for 9 years, and I know the difference. I got up at 11:45 and came downstairs, and he was sitting at the kitchen door looking toward the fence with his head slightly tilted. I put the light on, which startled him, and he looked at me and then back at the door. I looked out the window. The field was empty. The moonlight was thin through the clouds, and the fence posts threw faint shadows toward the cottage. Nothing else was there. I went back to bed. But I lay awake for a while in a way I had not lain awake in some time, thinking about a dog who waits in the dark for something he knows is coming, and about a thermos cap placed with care on a fence rail, and about the particular kind of question my grandson had asked me at breakfast. The kind of question that is not really a question at all, but a door being held open just enough to see if anyone will walk through it. I did not know yet what was on the other side of that door. But I had been a stonemason for nearly 50 years, and I had learned that you do not ignore the places where the surface tells you something about what lies beneath. A crack that appears in a wall does not always indicate a problem in the wall itself. More often, it indicates something happening in the foundation, in the ground, in the weight distribution that the wall is carrying. You read the surface to understand the depths, and something in the surface of these days was telling me to pay closer attention than I had been. I want to stop here again because I think you are with me on this, and I want to know more about who is listening. Where are you in the world tonight? What time is it where you are? Have you ever had an experience like what I am describing, where something in the ordinary fabric of your daily life shifted almost imperceptibly, and you could not say what had changed, but something had, and you found yourself paying attention in a new way? Write that to me in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story is reaching you, leave a like, because that is the thing that tells me to keep going, to keep bringing these to you. Subscribe if you have not. There's a new story here every day. Now let me take you to the village. 3 days after Connor's question, I went into Ashford to collect my prescription from the chemist and to pick up the newspaper, which I do every Monday and Thursday regardless of weather, because the ritual matters to me, even when the news inside the paper does not. The village was quiet, in the way that Ashford is quiet on a Monday in the grey end of winter, which is not empty exactly, but collected. A handful of people going about their business without urgency, the way people move when the season has not yet given them a reason to hurry. I stopped for coffee at the small cafe near the post office, which is run by a woman named Pauline Murta, who has been running it since before her hair went silver and who makes the best brown bread in the county. A fact I have stated in her presence and intend to go on stating. I sat at the window table and drank my coffee and watched the street and thought about nothing in particular, which is a skill that takes longer to develop than most people realize, and which I have spent the better part of 7 decades perfecting. And then Pauline came to collect my cup and lingered in the way she sometimes does when she has something on her mind. She asked me how Connor was getting on. I told her he was well, good lad, busy with the work at the estates. She said she had seen him a few times coming through the village in the evenings, sometimes after dark, and that he always waved. I said that was like him. And then she said something that I did not fully register until I was driving home. She said she had also seen someone she did not recognize, walking back along the lane toward the Rathnew Road on several recent evenings. An older man, she thought, walking with the particular unhurried gait of someone who is not going anywhere urgently, but who is going somewhere with purpose. She had assumed he was staying at the guest house beyond the crossroads, or perhaps visiting one of the properties up the valley. She had thought nothing of it at the time. I drove home along the Glenelly Road and parked in the yard and sat in the car for a few minutes before going inside. The lane that runs along the far edge of the Brennan Field joins the Rathnew Road about 300 meters from my front gate. If someone were walking that lane in the evenings and returning to the road, they would pass within easy sight of the cafe on their way through the village, if they came through the village at all. Not all of this was connecting yet, but the pieces were accumulating, the way stones accumulate beside a foundation trench before the work begins, before you can see what they are going to become. That evening I asked Connor, as casually as I could manage, whether he had ever seen the man arrive, or whether he had only ever seen him already standing at the fence. Connor considered this for a moment, setting down his fork in the way he does when he is giving a question its proper weight. He said he had seen him walking across the field from the direction of the lane once, on the second evening, and returning the same way after. He said the man walked carefully, not slowly, but carefully, as if he was aware of the ground beneath his feet. And he said the man had never, on any of the evenings Connor had observed him, looked toward the cottage windows, which he had thought was unusual. If you were curious about the cottage, he said, you would look at it. This man looked only at the fence itself. I thought about that for a long time that night. A man who stands at a fence in the dark and looks at the fence, rather than at the house it belongs to, is not looking for the house. He is not curious about whoever lives there, or not primarily. He is looking at the fence, or he is looking at something the fence represents, or he is standing in a place that matters to him for reasons that have nothing to do with the fence as a physical object, and the fence is simply where he stands, because the field ends there and the cottage begins there, and that is the boundary he has chosen to keep. I have been a stonemason all my working life, which means I have spent most of those years thinking about boundaries. A wall is a boundary. A fence is a boundary. They are not the same thing in their materials or their construction, but they serve a related purpose, which is to say where one thing ends and another begins. In my experience, the boundaries that matter most to people are rarely the legal ones, the ones marked on the land registry maps and settled by solicitors. The boundaries that matter are the ones that carry meaning. The edge of a garden where a child played, the wall of a house where a family lived, the fence line between a property and a field where something important happened once, or where someone important stood, or where something was said or not said that echoed down through the years afterward. I did not know yet whose boundary this was, but I was beginning to understand that it belonged to someone, and that someone was still coming back to it. Let me tell you about the sort of man I am, because you need to understand that before you can understand the choices I made in the weeks that followed, and the choice I made at the end, which is the one that matters most. I was born on this land in the year 1950, the second of 4 children, the only boy among 3 sisters until my brother Padraig came along when I was 6. My father was a stone mason, and his father before him, and the trade was not something any of us chose so much as grew into, the way a tree grows into the shape the wind and the soil between them have already decided. I was working on site with my father from the age of 14, carrying and sorting and fetching, learning the grain of different stones the way other boys were learning multiplication tables, understanding without being told which stone would split and which would hold, which was load-bearing and which was decorative, and why the difference was not always obvious from the surface. By the time I served my formal apprenticeship, I already knew most of it. But the formal apprenticeship taught me the parts I had not known I was missing, and one of them was this. The most important thing about a wall is not the stone, it is the mortar. The stone provides the structure and the strength, but without the mortar holding the joints, without the patient, carefully mixed, properly set compound, filling every gap and keeping the water out, and distributing the weight evenly, the stone is just a pile of rocks. The mortar is invisible when the work is done. You do not see it. You see only the stone. But take it away, and the whole thing falls. I have thought about that metaphor many times in the course of my life when I was trying to understand why certain relationships held and others collapsed. What is the mortar in a family? What is the invisible thing that fills the gaps between people and keeps the water out and distributes the weight? In my family, that thing was Bridget. She was from Roundwood originally, the 3rd daughter of a farmer who kept sheep above the reservoir, a man of enormous physical presence, and almost no conversational output, who had communicated primarily through actions for the first 60 years of his life, and then surprised everyone by becoming extremely talkative in his late 60s, as though he had been accumulating words his whole life and had finally reached the point where they needed somewhere to go. Bridget had some of that in her. She was warm and attentive and present in a way that made everyone in her company feel accounted for. But she was not effusive, not the kind of person who filled silence for the sake of filling it. She let silence be what it needed to be. She understood the difference between a silence that was comfortable and a silence that was carrying something, and she had an uncanny ability to know which kind she was sitting inside. She also, as I would come to learn gradually over 41 years of marriage, had a habit of doing things for people without announcing that she had done them. Small things mostly. A pot of soup left with a neighbor who was recovering from surgery. A prescription collected and delivered to someone who could not drive. A note sent to a person she thought might need to know someone was thinking of them. These were not gestures performed for recognition. They were simply things she did because they seemed to her like the right things to do. And then she moved on without dwelling on them. I knew about some of them only by accident, when a neighbor mentioned it years later, or when a card arrived from someone whose name I half remembered. The full extent of her quiet generosity I suspect I will never know, because she was careful to keep it quiet. I want to pause here and speak to you directly for a moment, because what I have just described to you, this quality in Bridget, this way of doing good things in the background without needing anyone to see them, I think that is something that speaks to something in all of us, a kindness that asks for nothing in return, a presence that steadies the people around it without making a show of steadying them. Have you known someone like that? Write to me in the comments. Tell me who that person is or was in your life. I think a lot of you have. And if this story is reaching that place in you, leave a like. It means more than you might think. Subscribe if you have not yet, and share this one with someone who needs to hear about a woman like Bridget, because I think there are a lot of those people out there tonight. All right, let me go on. I mentioned that my brother Padraig worked alongside me on the fence in 1983. What I did not mention was that he had, by that time, been working for nearly 15 years for Irish Rail, which was not called that in those years, but which became that in due course, and that he was by then a senior track engineer, responsible for a considerable stretch of line in the east of the country. Padraig had gone into that work because our father had hoped that one of his sons would be a stonemason and the other would do something that involved an indoor desk and a steady salary, and Padraig had obliged him. He liked the work. He was precise and methodical, and he understood systems in the way I understood stone, which is to say from the inside, from the feel of the thing, rather than only from the measurements. He stayed with Irish Rail until his retirement, working his way up through the grades, and along the way he worked with a great many men whose names I knew only from Padraig's occasional references at Christmas dinners or family gatherings over the years. One of those names was Arthur Byrne. I knew the name in the way you know the names of your siblings' colleagues, which is to say imperfectly and in fragments. Arthur was a good engineer, Padraig had said once. Meticulous, quiet. The kind of man who found the problem before it became a problem, which, in railway engineering, Padraig had explained, was the difference between a maintenance job and a catastrophe. I had formed no particular impression of this Arthur Byrne because I had never met him and he had been only a name in the background of Padraig's working life. And then Padraig had passed and his working life had passed with him, and the names in it had faded into the general past. I had not thought of Arthur Byrne in years, not once. Until the morning I went down to the post office in Ashford and met Noreen Fitzpatrick, who is 82 and who has been the informal keeper of local knowledge for as long as I can remember. A woman who misses nothing and forgets nothing, and who delivers information with the gentle relentlessness of a steady rain. She had seen me parking and had waited for me outside the post office with the cheerful patience of someone who has all the time in the world and intends to use some of it. She asked me how I was keeping. I told her I was keeping well enough. She asked about Connor, whom she had known since he was a boy, and I told her Connor was well and busy with the work at the estates. And then she said, in the slightly lowered voice that signals in Noreen's conversational register, that she is about to say something that matters, that she had seen Arthur Byrne recently, which she had not expected to. As she had understood, he had moved to Wexford some years ago, after everything that happened with his family. I asked her which Arthur Byrne she meant. She gave me the look she reserves for questions whose answers ought to be obvious. Arthur Byrne, she said, who had worked on the railway these 35 years, who was a great friend of your Padraig's, God rest him, who lost his wife and his son within the one terrible year. Surely I remembered. I told her I remembered the name from Padraig, but that I had never met the man. She seemed surprised by this, as though a connection that felt obvious to her from the outside should have been equally obvious to me from the inside. She said that Arthur had been close to Padraig, genuinely close in the way that men who work together through difficult things become close, and that after Padraig passed, Arthur had come to the funeral, had stood at the graveside, had been one of the last to leave. I had been there, of course. I had stood at that graveside myself and seen the faces of Padraig's colleagues, but there had been so many people, and I had been in that particular kind of grief that narrows your peripheral vision and makes the faces beyond the immediate circle blur into a general crowd. She said that Arthur Byrne had settled back in the Wicklow area after leaving Wexford. She thought he was renting somewhere near Rathnew, and she had seen him in the village a few times in the past month or so, passing through quietly in the evenings. I stood outside the post office in the gray morning and felt something shift in the way that things shift sometimes, not dramatically, not with any particular force, but the way a key turns in a lock that has been stiff for a long time, the small, precise movement that releases something. I drove home carefully, thinking. A retired railway engineer who had been a close colleague and friend of my brother Padraig. A man who had lost his wife and his son in the same year, which I had not known, and which sat in me now with a considerable weight. A man who had come to Padraig's funeral and stood at the graveside. A man who was now living near Rathnew and who had been seen in the village in the evenings. A man who was standing at my fence in the dark and looking at it, not at the cottage, and then setting a thermos cap on the rail with care and walking back across the field. I made a pot of tea when I got home and sat at the kitchen table without drinking it for a long time. Finn came and put his head on my knee, and I put my hand on his head, and we sat there together in the particular companionship of old dog and old man, which is one of the better kinds of companionship available to a person of my age, I have found. The tea went cold. The light changed. I was not thinking so much as I was letting the things I now knew settle into their proper positions, the way you let the stones find their level in a dry wall before you begin to mortar them. You do not force it. You wait for the weight to distribute naturally, and then you see what the structure is telling you. What the structure was telling me was this. Arthur Byrne had not come to my fence by accident. He had not wandered there from curiosity or from any external compulsion. He had come because something connected him to this place, to this particular corner of fence, and whatever that connection was, it was strong enough to bring him back on multiple evenings without ever once prompting him to knock on my door. A man who knows where a door is and chooses not to knock on it is making a deliberate choice. He is saying, in the language of restraint that men of my generation understand very well, I know this is here and I am not coming in. He is holding himself to the boundary. He is respecting it so completely that he does not even approach it directly, but stands on the far side of it and looks at the fence rather than at the house. That kind of restraint is not timidity. I have known timid men, and I know what timidity looks like. It makes itself small, pulls its shoulders in, looks at the ground. What I was being told about Arthur Byrne, through Noreen's account and through Connor's observations, and through the single thermos cap placed with such deliberate care on the top rail of a fence I had built with my brother's help, was not timidity. It was consideration of the most serious kind. A man who did not want to impose. A man who felt he had no right to knock. A man who was keeping his distance out of an excess of respect rather than a lack of courage. And I had been on this earth for 74 years, and I had worked with my hands all my life, and I had built walls and fences and repointed the joints of other men's houses and buried my brother and my wife, and I knew one thing about a boundary like that. A boundary kept solely out of consideration for the other person is a boundary that the other person has the right to invite you across. I needed to understand why he was here. I needed to know what connected him to this fence, to this corner, to these particular evenings of standing in the dark and looking at a rail where once, if Noreen was right, he had come to the funeral of a man he had loved like a brother and stood at the graveside and been one of the last to leave. I began, that afternoon, to look through the things Bridget had kept. Bridget was a keeper of things. Letters, cards, photographs, the small printed programs from concerts and plays and parish events, the memorial cards from funerals of people she had known across the decades. She kept them in a particular wooden box that had been her mother's, a simple thing of stained pine with a brass clasp, which had lived on the top shelf of the wardrobe in our bedroom since the first year we were married. I had not opened it since she passed. I had known it was there, and I had chosen not to open it because there are things you are not ready for, and the inside of that box was one of them. But I was ready now, or near enough to ready that it would do. I brought it down from the shelf and sat with it on the bed in the afternoon light, which was thin and gray, and came in sideways through the window the way February light does in Wicklow, making everything look slightly older than it is. I opened the clasp. The smell that came out of the box was Bridget's smell, or a ghost of it, a trace of the particular soap she had used and the particular air that surrounded her things in the particular order she kept them. I sat with that for a moment. Then I began to look. The letters were organized by decade, which was like her, practical and sequential. I found what I was looking for without too much difficulty because her organization was sound. There were 3 letters and 2 cards, all addressed to her in a handwriting I did not recognize, and the name signed at the bottom of each one was Arthur. Not Arthur Byrne, just Arthur. The way you sign a letter to someone who knows exactly who you are. The first letter was dated 11 years ago. It was brief, 2 pages of careful handwriting, and it thanked Bridget for something she had said to him on an unspecified occasion, something that had helped him through a particularly dark period. He did not describe the dark period, but given what Noreen had told me about the loss of his wife and son, I could make a reasonable inference. The letter said that he had not thought he would find his way through and that her words had given him a reason to try. He said that he hoped she and her husband were keeping well and that he thought of Padraig often. He said he occasionally drove past the property on the Glenelly Road and that simply knowing the lights were on inside was a comfort to him. He apologized for saying something so peculiar. He said he understood if it sounded strange. He signed himself Arthur and wished her health and peace. I read that letter twice, and then I set it on the bed beside me and looked at the wall for a while. He had been coming past the property for 11 years then. At minimum, Bridget had known. She had written to him, said something to him in person at some point, something that mattered enough that he felt moved to write and thank her for it. And she had, in the way that was entirely consistent with everything I had known about her, kept this knowledge quietly and done whatever she could to help from a comfortable distance without making it into something that required anyone to perform gratitude or explain themselves. I thought about the particular sentence. Simply knowing the lights were on inside was a comfort to him. I thought about how long the lights had been on inside this cottage. Since my father's time, before that, back generations. I thought about what a light means when you are alone in a darkness that is not meteorological but internal, when you have lost your wife and your son in the same year and the world has lost whatever legibility it previously possessed. I thought about what it would mean, in that condition, to know that somewhere nearby there was a house where the lights were on, and where people lived who knew your name and who had offered you a kindness. And I thought about what it would mean to go on passing that house for 11 years, in the particular way that Arthur Byrne apparently had, standing at the boundary in the dark and drawing whatever comfort was available from the lights, and then walking back across the field without ever asking for more than that. The second letter was shorter, written about 8 years ago, and it told Bridget that he had moved to Wexford, but that he thought of the Wicklow Hills often and hoped she was well. The third letter was from 5 years ago, written 6 months after Bridget had passed, addressed to me at the cottage, and I saw with a small shock that I had never received it. It was dated in August of the year she died. In it, Arthur wrote to say that he had learned of Bridget's passing from someone in the village and that he was deeply sorry for my loss. He wrote that she had been, in his experience, a woman of extraordinary and quiet goodness, and that she had done something for him at a time when he had needed it very badly, and that he had never properly been able to thank her. He said he hoped I was keeping and that he would not impose, but that he had wanted me to know that she had mattered to someone other than those who knew her well. This letter had never reached me. It had been in the box, which meant that Bridget had received it, perhaps intercepted it, perhaps been collecting the post when it arrived, and had placed it in the box without telling me about it. I could not know why. Perhaps she had intended to give it to me at some point and had not found the right moment. Perhaps she had wanted to protect me from a grief I was already carrying. Perhaps there was some other reason that I would never now be able to ask her about. I sat with those letters in the thin afternoon light for a long time. Outside, the field was empty. The fence stood where it had stood since 1983. The corner post that Bridget had once insisted was not plumb was as plumb as it had ever been. And somewhere between Rathnew and Ashford, a retired railway engineer who had been driving past this property for 11 years, who had been coming to stand at this fence for weeks, and who had once written a letter to my wife thanking her for keeping the lights on, was living alone and keeping his distance with a consideration that I was only now beginning to fully understand. The next morning I told Connor what I had found. I told him about the letters and about what Noreen Fitzpatrick had told me and about my brother Padraig's connection to Arthur Byrne. Connor listened without interrupting, the way he does. And when I had finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that he'd not wanted to tell me how long he had been watching, because he had not been sure it was his information to share. He said the man had never done anything that seemed threatening or strange. He had simply stood there with the quality of a person standing somewhere they belonged, or had once belonged, or wished they belonged. I said I thought that was about right. Connor asked what I was going to do. I told him I was going to do what Bridget would have done, which was the obvious thing, which was also the kind thing, which were usually the same thing in her experience, and which I intended to make the same thing in mine. I made 2 mugs of tea. I put them on the tray. I went out the back door into the evening. The evening I walked out with those 2 mugs of tea was a Wednesday in late March, and the light at that hour had begun to carry the first suggestion of the season changing, not warmth exactly, not yet, but a quality of gold in the last 20 minutes before the sun went fully behind the hills that you do not get in January or February. That particular Wicklow evening light that comes back every spring like something you had almost forgotten the name of, and then recognize the moment you see it again. The grass in the Brennan field was beginning to green properly after the gray of winter. The ash trees on the eastern boundary were still bare, but there was a faint bronze in the tips of the branches that would be leaves in another month. A blackbird was singing somewhere behind the cottage with the absolute conviction of a creature who knows exactly where he stands in the world and considers his position a good one. I walked to the fence. He was already there on the far side, standing at the corner post the way Connor had described, the same careful stillness, looking at the fence rail rather than at the cottage or at me. He was a man of perhaps 67 or 68 years, I would have estimated, which I later learned was exactly right, wearing a dark coat that had seen some years and good boots of the kind that are made for walking on real ground rather than on pavements. He was not tall, average height or slightly below it, with a particular set of the shoulders that comes from a lifetime of working with precision, the slight forward lean of a man who has spent decades looking at details that required him to bring himself close to the thing he was examining. His hair was gray and cut neatly, and his hands, which were at his sides, were the hands of a working man, large-knuckled and deliberate. He saw me coming, and he did not move. He did not step back or look away. He simply waited, with the stillness of a man who has made his peace with whatever is about to happen and is prepared to receive it with dignity. That quality of waiting told me something important about him before he said a single word. I came to the fence and set the 2 mugs on the top rail between us. I looked at him. He looked at me, and I said what I had decided to say, which was simple, which was the only thing that needed saying. "You have been standing outside long enough," I said. "The gate has never been locked." He looked at the mugs of tea for a moment. Then he looked at me, and I saw in his face the particular expression of a man who has been carrying something alone for a very long time, and who has just been told that he does not have to carry it alone anymore, which is an expression I know because I have seen it in my own face in certain mirrors on certain mornings, and because I have spent enough of my life working alongside men who do not speak easily about the things they carry to be able to read it without needing it to be explained to me. He said, "You know who I am." I told him I knew. I told him about the letters in Bridget's box and about Noreen Fitzpatrick and about what Padraig had said of him over the years. I told him Connor had seen him and had thought carefully about whether to say anything and had ultimately asked me in the way that he had. Arthur Byrne listened to all of this with the same quality of attention he had given the fence rail, which was total and patient and without any impulse to rush toward the end of it. Then he told me why he had come. Let me take my time with this part, because it deserves its time. He had been living in Wexford for 6 years after leaving Wicklow in the aftermath of losing his wife and his son, both within the same calendar year, which is a loss I cannot adequately describe with words and will not try to, except to say that it has a weight that is in a different category from ordinary grief, that it reorganizes the interior of a person in ways that take years to begin to understand, and that are perhaps never fully completed. He had gone to Wexford because a cousin lived there and because he had needed to be somewhere that was not filled with the specific topography of what he had lost. He had tried to build a life there of a modest and functional kind. He had not entirely failed. But he had not entirely succeeded either, and in the way that sometimes happens to people who are separated from the landscape of their deepest years, he had found that something essential was missing, and that no amount of practical stability could substitute for it. He had come back to County Wicklow 18 months ago. He was renting a small house outside Rathnew, a plain thing, comfortable enough, with a garden he was putting in order one bed at a time. He was healthy. He was not in difficulty of the material kind, but he was alone in the way that a person is alone when they have outlived the people whose presence gave the world its particular meaning and character, and he had not yet found a way to build new meaning sufficient to replace what was gone. He had driven past the Gleneley Road on the second Sunday after his return, not deliberately, or not entirely deliberately. He had told himself he was taking the long way home from somewhere, and that the road simply happened to go this way. He was not sure he had been entirely honest with himself about that. He had slowed the car when he came level with the cottage, not stopping, only slowing, looking at the chimney and the stone walls and the fence, the particular fence that he had heard Padraig describe once, the fence Padraig had helped his brother build, and that Padraig's sister-in-law had insisted was not plumb. He had smiled at the memory. He had driven on. He had come back on foot a week later, walking the lane from the Rathnew Road, coming across the Brennan field at dusk when there was no one about. He had not had any clear intention. He had simply found himself there at the corner post, standing in the way that I have now described, looking at the fence rail, and he had felt, standing there with the lights of the cottage visible across the grass, something that he was not sure he had felt in 6 years in Wexford, which was a reduction in the particular density of his loneliness, not its elimination. A reduction. Enough to notice. He had come back because it had helped. That was as simply as he could put it. It had helped, and he had needed help, and this was the form in which help had presented itself to him, and he had taken it with the care of a man who does not waste what little comfort he can find. He knew it was peculiar. He knew that if someone had told him the story from the outside, he would have found it difficult to explain. He had never intended to be seen. He had never intended to be anything other than a man standing quietly in a field for a few minutes in the evening, drawing from the visible evidence of other people's continued living whatever small restoration was available to him in it, and then going home and making his own tea and going about his own night. He had not knocked on my door because he had not believed he had any right to. Bridget had been kind to him in the past. Bridget was gone. Whatever right of access her kindness had given him felt, to his mind, as though it had ended with her, because the kindness had been personal and specific and belonging to her in a way that could not be transferred. He picked up the mug of tea from the fence rail and held it in both hands and looked across the grass toward the cottage. "She told me once," he said, "that the gate was never locked." And there it was, the sentence that explained everything. Bridget, in the way that was entirely consistent with the letters and with every other thing I had known about her across 41 years, had told him exactly that. Not as a figure of speech, as a statement of available fact. The gate is not locked. You're permitted to come in. You do not need to stand on the far side of this boundary to feel whatever comfort this place can offer you. You may come closer. She had told him this years ago when he was at his lowest. He had believed her. He had begun doing exactly that, coming to the fence and standing for a few minutes in the evening, and it had helped him, and he had continued doing it through the worst of his years, because it was one of the few things available to him that helped. And then Bridget had passed, and the logic that had permitted him the freedom of her invitation had seemed to him to expire with her. And he had not come any more, and then he had moved to Wexford, and 6 years had gone, and then he had come back and found that the old need was still there, and the old remedy still called to him, and he had begun coming to the fence again, but he had not felt that he had the right to come any closer because the woman who had given him that right was no longer here. I want to stop here, because I think you are feeling something right now, and I want to acknowledge that. What Arthur Byrne has just described to you is something I think a great many of us understand in some form. The experience of feeling that you are only permitted to be where you are because of a specific person's permission, and that when that person is gone, the permission goes with them. The experience of standing on the other side of something and believing that the welcome has ended. Have you felt that? Have you stood on the wrong side of a fence in that way, real or otherwise? Leave me a comment and tell me where you are listening from. Tell me what time it is there. If this story is landing somewhere real in you, leave a like, because that is what keeps me here every day with a new one. Subscribe if you have not. And share this one, because I think there is somebody who needs to hear this tonight, and you probably already know who that is. All right, let me take you forward. I opened the gate that evening, not metaphorically. I walked 30 feet along the fence to the wooden gate I had fitted into it in 1990 for the sake of easier access to the Brennan field during the years when the Brennans had run cattle and we had an informal arrangement about mending the lower fence, and I lifted the latch and swung it open. I said nothing. I simply opened it and stood back from it. Arthur Byrne looked at the open gate. He looked at me. He looked at the open gate again, and then he came through it, and I pulled it shut behind him. And and we walked back to the cottage in the late evening light with our mugs of tea. And Finn came out from the porch and sniffed at Arthur's boots and gave him a look of complete professional evaluation, and then apparently decided he was acceptable, because he fell into step beside him, which Finn does not do for everyone, and which I have learned over 9 years to regard as a reliable indicator of character. Connor was inside making something with pasta that smelled very good, and he looked up when we came in and gave Arthur Byrne a nod of the particular quality that means, "I know who you are, and I am glad you are here." We sat at the kitchen table, and Arthur drank his tea, and I poured a small drop of whiskey into my own, as it was that kind of evening, and we began to talk. The first thing Arthur said, after a few minutes of the sort of quiet that settles around a table when people are getting their bearings, was that he had not been inside a house with other people in it for 11 days. He said it without complaint, purely as information, and I received it in the same spirit, which was with a small and private recognition of the particular arithmetic of solitude that a man arrives at after a certain age and a certain set of losses. 11 days. I had counted such days myself after Bridget went. The longest stretch had been 16. We talked for a long time that evening. About Padraig, mostly, which was what connected us, and which was therefore where we naturally began. Arthur told me things about Padraig that I had not known, because the portion of my brother's life that occurred inside his working world was a portion I had known only through his occasional and characteristically understated summaries. I had known Padraig as a brother, which is to say I had known him completely in some dimensions and not at all in others, the way you know anyone whom you have loved since before you had the language to describe what knowing someone means. Arthur had known him as a colleague and eventually as a friend, which is a different and in some ways more clearly seen kind of knowing, because professional friendship strips away the assumptions of family and requires a person to present themselves on their own terms, to be taken on those terms. What Arthur had seen in Padraig, taken on those terms, was a man of extraordinary steadiness, a man who never needed to be the loudest voice in any room, and who was trusted by everyone who worked with him because the trust was entirely warranted and had been proven so repeatedly over many years. I knew those things about Padraig already, but hearing them from another man who had seen them from a different angle was like seeing a photograph of someone you love from a direction you had not known existed, the same face and yet new, catching a light you had not been standing in the right position to see when they were alive. We talked about Bridget. Arthur told me what she had said to him in the bad years, which I will not reproduce here in full because it was private in the way that the best things a person says are private, specific to the moment and the person and the particular configuration of need and compassion that produced them, and to remove them from that context would diminish them. But the substance of it was this. She had told him that loneliness was not a character failing, but a condition of caring about people, and that a man who felt the absence of those he loved deeply was simply a man who had loved deeply, and that this was not a wound to be ashamed of, but a wound to be respected, because it was the shape of something that had been real. She had told him that the lights in other people's homes were not evidence of a life he was excluded from, but evidence that life went on, and that this was a comfort rather than an insult, and that he was permitted to take comfort from it. And she had told him that the gate was not locked. I sat with that for a moment, hearing it from him in my own kitchen, in the light that was growing warmer as Connor's pasta sent steam toward the ceiling and Finn settled under the table with the satisfaction of a dog whose judgment has been borne out by events. I sat with the knowledge that she had said these things to this man, that she had known about his visits, that she had, in some quiet and characteristic way, sanctioned them and welcomed them without ever making a production of it, without ever once, in 41 years, mentioning it to me, which was not secretiveness, but simply her sense of what required to be said and what did not. What required to be said, she had apparently decided, was that the gate was not locked. Everything else, she must have judged, would follow from that in its own time. She was right. Everything else was following from that now, 4 years after her death. On a Wednesday evening in late March, with the light going gold through the kitchen windows and a retired railway engineer sitting at my kitchen table, telling me things about my brother that I had not known and about my wife that I had not known, and which were making me feel, for the first time in a considerable while, that the world was larger and kinder than it can look on the inside of a grief you have been living alone. I need to tell you about something else Arthur told me that evening, because it is important for understanding the full shape of what Bridget had done and how far back it went. When Arthur had lost his wife in the first of the 2 terrible years, he had gone through a period of several months in which he had found it almost impossible to maintain the ordinary functions of daily life, not dramatically, not in a way that became a crisis requiring intervention, but in the quiet and cumulative way of a man who goes through the motions without conviction, who wakes and dresses and works and returns and sleeps and wakes again, carrying out the sequence with the mechanical persistence of someone who cannot quite remember why the sequence matters, but has not yet found a reason to stop. He had been working alongside Padraig through this period, and Padraig had seen it, and Padraig had not said much, which was like Padraig, but had done something. He had brought Arthur home to this cottage one Sunday afternoon on some pretext about a stone wall in the garden that needed looking at, which there probably had been, because there is always a stone wall in this garden that needs looking at, and Bridget had made them tea and a meal and had been exactly herself, which is to say warm and present and not excessive about it. And Arthur had sat at this very table and felt, for the first time in months, like a person who was in a place where he belonged. He had not been back for several months after that. Then Padraig had died, and the second loss had arrived on top of the first, and the two of them together had produced a darkness that he had not known how to navigate. And Bridget had written to him. A short letter, not elaborate, finding his address through Padraig's widow, saying simply that she was sorry for his losses, plural, which told him that she knew about both, and that if he was ever in Wicklow, he should not hesitate to call. He had not called. He had driven past the property twice in the following year. The second time, he had stopped the car on the lane and stood at the fence for a few minutes. He was not sure why. It had simply seemed like the right distance, the right boundary, close enough to feel the warmth of the place from, far enough to maintain the respect he believed he owed to people who had not invited him to arrive at their door unannounced. The next time he had done it, Bridget had been looking out the kitchen window. She had come out and met him at the fence and told him he was a great fool to be standing in a field in November when there was perfectly good tea on the hob. He had come in. They had talked for an hour. When he was leaving, she had walked with him to the gate and said what she said, which was that the gate was not locked and that he was to remember it. He had been coming to the fence on and off for the 7 years between that conversation and her death. Sometimes he came in. More often he did not. Sometimes he came only late in the evening when he knew they would likely be inside and stood at the corner post for a few minutes and then went home. He had never been entirely sure which of these two ways of coming served him better, and so he had practiced both. But he had never once, in all of those years, come without the sense that the welcome was real, and that the gate was genuinely, literally, not locked. After her death he had stopped. The welcome had been personal. It had been hers. He had not felt it was transferable. And here we came to the part of the story that I needed to think about very carefully, and which I want to take some time with now. The question of whether a welcome can survive the person who extended it, whether an invitation outlasts the one who gave it, whether a gate that one person told you is unlocked remains unlocked when that person is gone, or whether the unlocking was an act so specific and personal that it can only belong to them and expires with them. I do not think there's a single answer to that question that applies to all cases, but I can tell you what I think the answer is in this particular case, which is the only case I have direct knowledge of. Bridget had told Arthur Byrne that the gate was not locked. She had meant it as a statement of available fact about our shared life and our shared home, not as a personal dispensation that she alone controlled. She had not said the gate is unlocked for you while I am here and will relock when I am gone. She had said the gate is not locked, present tense, as a condition of the place rather than a condition of her presence. I believed that. I believe it still. And I believed on that Wednesday evening in March, sitting at my kitchen table with this man who had loved my brother and been helped by my wife and who had been standing at the fence in the dark out of an excess of respect, that the correct response to the situation was the one Bridget would have made, which was to point out that the gate was still unlocked and that the fence was still there, and that standing outside it in November when there was tea on the hob was still, as it had always been, a great waste of a Wednesday evening. I told him as much. Connor brought the pasta to the table and set a third bowl down without being asked, which told me something important about my grandson that I had not needed to be told, but was glad to have confirmed. We ate. The evening went on. Finn moved from under the table to the mat by the range when the temperature in the kitchen reached a level he found satisfactory. The blackbird had gone quiet outside, and the dark had come down over the Brennan field and over the fence and over the corner post where a thermos cap had rested on the rail 2 days before. Arthur Byrne ate his pasta and told us about railway engineering in the 1980s and 90s, which was more interesting than it might sound, because the man who tells you about a thing he spent his life caring about and who tells it properly is always interesting. Because you are not actually hearing about the thing, you are hearing about the mind and the heart and the particular character of the person who gave themselves to it. Connor asked good questions, the way he does, and I mostly listened, which was what I had needed to do all evening without quite knowing it, which was to simply sit in a room with people and let the conversation go where it needed to go without feeling responsible for directing it. Before he left, Arthur picked up his coat from the back of the chair and stood for a moment looking around the kitchen with the expression of a man committing something to memory. I understood that expression. I have worn it myself in places I was not sure I would see again and wanted to carry the detail of them forward into whatever came next. He said that he had not expected this, that he had not come expecting anything in particular when he had begun coming to the fence again, and that he had certainly not expected to end an evening in a warm kitchen with a bowl of pasta and the knowledge that he was welcome to come back. I told him to come back on Sunday. I told him I made a proper pot of soup on Sunday afternoons, which was true, and that if he had nothing better to do with a Sunday afternoon, I could use the company, which was also true, and which I said in the way that men of my generation say things that are entirely true and important, which is without very much apparent emphasis, as though the truth of it were incidental rather than the whole point. He said he would come on Sunday, and he did. The Sundays became a habit, and habits, in my experience, are the structures that keep a life from coming apart at the seams when the larger architecture of meaning has been disrupted. Not all habits are good ones, but the good ones have a quiet power that is easy to underestimate because it does not announce itself. The habit of making soup on Sunday. The habit of a man coming through the gate on Sunday afternoon. The habit of Finn going to the gate at 2:30 without being told because he had learned, with the infallible exactitude of a dog who likes things to go as expected, that this was when Arthur Byrne arrived. I want to stop here and ask you something before I go any further, because we are getting to the part of this story that I have thought about the most, the part that I think carries the thing worth carrying away from all of it. If you have been with me this far, and I believe you have, I want to know something. Have you ever held back from something that was available to you because you were not sure you had the right to take it? Have you ever stood on the wrong side of a gate, real or otherwise, because the person who originally told you the gate was open was no longer there to confirm it? I think a great many of us have done that. And I think a great many of us are doing it right now in some area of our lives, and I want you to sit with that while I go on with the story. Leave me a comment. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me where you are in the world and what the evening looks like from where you are sitting. Leave a like if this is reaching somewhere real in you. Subscribe if you have not. And if you know someone who is standing on the wrong side of a gate tonight, consider sending them this story, because sometimes the thing a person needs to hear is being said by a stranger, and you never know who is listening at the exact right moment. All right, let me take you to the Sunday afternoons. The soup was always potato and leek in those early weeks because March and April are potato and leek months in this part of the world, and I make it the way my mother made it, which is without any cleverness or unnecessary additions, just the leeks and the potatoes and a good stock and enough time for it to become itself. Arthur ate it with the seriousness it deserved and always had a second bowl, which I took as a mark of genuine appreciation rather than politeness, because a man who is being merely polite stops at one bowl. Connor joined us when he was not working, and in those weeks he was often working on Sundays, overseeing the more time-sensitive phases of the garden restoration at Powerscourt. But he came when he could, and when he could not, he left us to it, which was the right instinct. Arthur and I found our way into conversation the way two men of a certain age find their way into conversation, which is obliquely through shared references and professional interests, and the particular vocabulary of having lived through the same decades in the same general part of the world. We talked about stone and about iron and about the things that last and the things that do not. And we talked about Padraig, and we talked about the county as it had been and as it was now. And sometimes we talked about our wives, tentatively at first, and then with increasing ease, as trust established itself between us the way trust does, through accumulated time and consistent behavior rather than through any single declarative act. Arthur had been married to a woman named Eileen for 29 years. She had been a primary school teacher in Rathnew and was remembered by people in the village with the particular warmth that is reserved for the teachers who shaped a generation's early years and are now gone. He talked about her in the way that a man who has made peace with a loss still talks about it, which is to say with love and with grief in equal measure, neither one obscuring the other, the way two colors exist simultaneously in a piece of granite without either one canceling the other out. He missed her with the consistency of a man who has accepted that the missing is simply a permanent feature of the landscape now, not an emergency, but a weather, something to dress appropriately for and to live inside without expecting it to leave. I recognize that because it was what I did with Bridget. I want to tell you about a particular Sunday in early May, 6 weeks after Arthur had first come through the gate, because it was the Sunday that shifted something important in the character of what was building between us. Connor had gone into Wicklow town that afternoon, and it was just the two of us at the kitchen table with the soup and the bread and the particular quality of May afternoon light that comes through the western window of the kitchen and makes everything look as though it has been considered carefully before being placed where it is. We had been talking about the Domain Wall project at Rathnew, and I had been asking Arthur questions about the condition of the drainage on the lower section, because I had done some work on a similar wall decades ago, and the drainage had been the determining factor in how long the restoration lasted. It was a technical conversation about old stone and old water, which is the kind of conversation I find genuinely restful, and we had been settled in it for perhaps 20 minutes when Arthur set his bowl down and was quiet for a moment in a different way than the ordinary quiet of the conversation. He asked me whether I had found it strange, the way his visits to the fence had gone on without my knowing. Whether it had troubled me, thinking about it afterward, to realize that something had been happening at the edge of my property for years, and I had been entirely unaware of it. It was a direct question of the kind that direct men ask when they have been sitting with something for a while and have decided to say it rather than continue sitting with it alone. I appreciated the directness. I thought about the answer carefully before I gave it. I told him no, it had not troubled me. I told him that I understood it as Bridget had understood it, which was as a simple human need being met in the only way available to the person who had it. I told him that the image of him standing at the fence in the dark, not seeking to intrude or to ask for anything, simply being near a place that offered him some comfort in a difficult time, was not a strange or troubling image to me. It was a familiar one, because I had done my own version of it in the months after Bridget passed, which was to drive past certain places that were associated with her, the road where she had grown up in Roundwood, the church where we had been married, the particular section of the coastal road south of Wicklow Town where we had walked when we were courting, and to slow the car and look and then drive on. I had not told anyone I was doing it because it had not seemed like information that needed sharing. It had simply been a way of staying near the geography of a life that was no longer the same life it had been. Arthur listened to this with the quality of attention he gave to everything, which was total, and then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said that one of the things he found most surprising about grief, having now had considerable experience of it, was how much of it was spatial, how much it had to do with places rather than with people. He said that in the beginning he had understood grief as being about the person who was gone, about the absence of that specific individual, about the empty chair and the silent telephone and the side of the bed that no longer held the shape of anyone. And all of that was true and was part of it. But what he had not anticipated was how much of the grief would attach itself to geography, to the specific places where a life had been lived. The house, the roads, the church, the fence at the edge of a friend's property. As though the love that had existed between people had left traces in the physical world, small deposits of meaning that remained after the people themselves were gone, and that returning to those places was a way of finding the traces again, of reassuring yourself that the love had been real, that it had left its mark on the world, even if it could no longer speak for itself. I have been a stonemason all my working life, and I can tell you that what Arthur Byrne described that afternoon was something I recognized from the stone. There's a concept in the trade about the memory that stone holds. Not mysticism, nothing like that. Simple physics. Stone that has been bearing weight for a long time will show the record of that weight in its surface, in the compression of the mortar at the joint, in the slight settling of the courses, in the trace left by water running the same path for 50 years. The wall remembers the weight it has carried. The weight has become part of the wall. You can read it if you know how to look. The boundary fence at the edge of my property had been built in 1983. It had been standing for over 40 years. And it had been. For a period of years I was only now learning the full extent of a place that someone had come to in the dark and stood beside for reasons of the heart. That had become part of the fence in the way that use becomes part of stone. It was there if you knew how to look. I told Connor about that conversation later in the week, and he listened with his particular quality of attention, and then said that he thought this was probably true of most places that people have loved and lived in and cared about for a long time, that the love left a residue in the physical environment, and that this was probably one of the reasons why certain old places had the atmosphere they had, the particular weight and warmth that you felt in a building that had been well used and well cared for across many generations. I thought he was probably right about that, and I told him so, which surprised him slightly, because I'm not generally a man who arrives at philosophical agreement that quickly, but I had the evidence of my own life in support of the idea, and I am not in the habit of arguing against evidence when it is sitting in front of me. Let me stop here for a moment and come back to you directly. We are getting toward the end of this story now, and I want to take stock of what we have been through together. You have been with me through the thermos cap on the fence rail and through Bridget's box of letters and through Arthur Byrne standing in the dark out of respect so extreme that it had begun to look like exclusion. You have been with me through the first bowl of soup and through the Sunday afternoons and through the conversation about grief and geography that happened in the May light in my kitchen. I want you to know that I am grateful for your company. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are tonight. Tell me what time it is. Tell me if you have known a grief, like the kind we have been talking about, the spatial kind, the kind that attaches to places, rather than only to people. And subscribe if you have not yet, because there is a new story here every day, and some of them will reach you in ways you do not expect. Like and share if this one has reached you. Now let me take you to the fence one last time. It was a Saturday in late September when I made the decision about the gate. Connor had finished his contract work at the estates, and was preparing to go back to Dublin the following week, and we had marked the occasion with a dinner at the kitchen table on Friday evening, Arthur joining us, the three of us sitting together long after the meal was finished with a bottle of wine that Connor had brought from somewhere and a seriousness of conversation that the occasion called for. We talked about Connor's plans and about the garden work he had done, and about whether he would be back to Wicklow for Christmas, which he confirmed he would, and about what winter looked like from where each of us was standing in our lives. The next morning, Saturday, I was out early, which I always am, and I walked the boundary of the property the way I do periodically, checking the condition of the fence and the walls, and noting anything that wants attention before the winter weather arrives. The boundary fence was, as I knew it would be, in sound condition throughout, because I had built it to last, and I had maintained it accordingly in the 40 years since. But when I came to the corner post, the particular corner post where Arthur had stood on so many evenings before and after and during the period of his patient distance, I stood there myself for a while, and looked at it, and looked at the field, and looked back at the cottage, and I thought about Bridget telling him the gate was not locked. And I thought about the 7 years of Sunday afternoons that had already happened, and the ones that would come, I hoped, through the winter and into the following year, and as far beyond that as life permitted. And I thought about the philosophy of welcome, and about what a boundary means when it is maintained not to keep people out, but to give them the choice of coming in or staying where they are. And I thought about a piece of stone that remembers the weight it has carried and carries that record in its surface for anyone who knows how to read it. I went to the shed and got my tools. I worked for the better part of Saturday morning and into the afternoon. The wood I used was from a section of oak that had been in the shed for several years, seasoned properly, straight-grained and dense, the kind of oak that will last 100 years in any weather Wicklow sees fit to put at it. I cut the uprights and the cross members and mortised the joints the way I had been taught, the way my father had taught me and his father had taught him, the joints that fit together without the need for metal fasteners, and that, made properly, are stronger than the wood itself. I fitted the hinges, which were iron, old stock that I had had in the shed, heavy and smooth and built for the long run. I hung the gate and the fence at the corner post, in the exact location where Arthur Byrne had stood on so many evenings in the dark. I did not fit a lock. I had never fitted a lock on the garden gate, and I was not going to start now. There is no lock on the gate of this property because there has never been a need for one, because this is Ashford in County Wicklow, and the people who come to this gate are people who belong at it, and the people who do not belong at it will find a better use of their time than climbing the fence of a retired stonemason who has lived on this land for 74 years, and knows every stick and stone of it. I did not tell Arthur about the gate before it was done. I had thought about whether to tell him in advance, and had decided not to, because the telling in advance would have turned it into a presentation, a formal acknowledgement, a gift being handed over with ceremony, and that was not the right register for it. The right register was practical, which is the register I know best, and the one I most trust. The gate is there. It is not locked. You may use it. That is the whole of the communication. He came on the Sunday, as he had been doing. He came across the Brennan field at 2:30, as he had been doing, and Finn went to the corner of the fence at 2:30, as he had been doing. But this Sunday, Finn went to the gate rather than to the fence line. Arthur saw it from the middle of the field, because a new gate in a fence you have been looking at for months is an unmistakable change. He came to it and stood for a moment with his hand on the latch, reading what it said, which was what I intended him to read from it, which was what Bridget had said to him years ago in this same place. He lifted the latch and came through the gate. Finn led him across the grass to the cottage. I had the soup on the hob. I heard the back door, and I called out that the soup was nearly ready and to sit down and leave his coat in the hook, which is what he did. We have not spoken about the gate in any direct way. That is as it should be. Some things say themselves most clearly when they are not said at all, when they exist simply as facts in the world, as practical realities that can be entered through and lived inside without requiring commentary. The gate is there. It is not locked. It has a good set of iron hinges and oak uprights that will outlast both of us by a considerable margin. It will be there in the morning and in the evening and in the dark of the winter nights, when the wind comes off the hills and the field fills with the kind of rain that Wicklow makes when it is serious about the business. It will be there in the summer when the lapwings come back to the depression in the middle of the Brennan field, and the blackbird starts up again in the evenings with his absolute conviction about the perfection of his position in the world. The gate is there, and the gate is not locked. I want to tell you one more thing before I take you to the end of this, and it is the thing I think this whole story has been moving toward, though I did not know it when I started telling it. It is about the kind of people who do not announce themselves, the kind of people who are present in your life in ways you do not fully see until circumstances give you a reason to look. Bridget was that kind of person. She moved through the world doing things for people without making those things into events, without requiring that her goodness be acknowledged or returned or even known about. She kept a wooden box of letters from a man she had helped, a man my brother had cared about, a man who had lost everything in the same terrible year and who had come to stand at our fence in the dark because it was the only form of warmth available to him. And she had told him the gate was not locked. And she had carried that quietly for years, and had not told me because it did not require telling. because the gate was not locked and the welcome was real, and those were simply facts about our life and our home, and they did not need to be explained to me, because I had lived them for 41 years, and I would, she must have believed, recognize them as facts when the time came to act on them. She was right. I recognized them, and I acted on them. And now, on Sunday afternoons, there's a man who comes through the gate in the corner of the fence with the good iron hinges, and Finn goes to meet him, and the soup is on the hob, and the kitchen fills up with a particular quality of warmth that a kitchen achieves when there are people in it who are glad to be in the same room as each other. The quiet glad, the kind that does not need to be announced, the kind that simply exists and can be felt by anyone paying sufficient attention. That is the whole of it. Some time has passed since that first Sunday soup, and I want to sit with you in the quiet of what has come after before I let this story go, because the after of a thing is where its real meaning lives. The before and the during are the drama, the tension, the searching. The after is where you find out what you were actually looking for and whether you found it. The after is where the stone sets. It is now the following February. A year has turned since Connor asked me his careful question at the breakfast table on that wet Sunday morning, and the year has moved through all of its Wicklow seasons, with the patient indifference to human affairs that seasons have always shown, the spring coming in cold and green over the hills above Roundwood, the summer brief and intermittently brilliant, the autumn long and amber and smelling of turf smoke and wet leaves, and now February again, which is the month I have the most complicated relationship with, as I have already told you, for reasons of the heart that have not changed and will not change. But February this year is a different February than the one before it, and the one before that, and the several before that. It is a February in which, on Sunday afternoons, there's a man who comes through the oak gate in the corner of the fence, and Finn goes to meet him, and the soup is on the hob. That is not nothing. In the arithmetic of a life lived past a certain point, that is not nothing at all. Let me tell you what the Sundays look like now, in February, in the winter light that is thin and gray and comes into the kitchen sideways and makes everything look exactly as old as it is. Arthur arrives at 2:30. He has learned the back lane well enough in all weathers that he does not vary the time by more than a few minutes in either direction, which is the habit of a railway engineer, a man whose entire professional life was organized around the premise that things should arrive when they are expected to arrive, and that the failure to do so is a disorder worth taking seriously. I find this quality of punctuality restful in a way I would not have anticipated. There is something steadying about a person who comes when they say they will come and leaves when it is time to leave and fills the interval between arrival and departure with their actual self, rather than with a performance of their self. That is what Arthur Byrne does. He comes. He is himself. He goes. And the space between his visits is a different quality of aloneness than the aloneness I was living in before the thermos cap appeared on the fence rail. The conversations have deepened in the way that conversations between people who have decided to trust each other do deepen, which is not through any single moment of disclosure or revelation, but through accumulation. The slow building of a shared language and a shared set of references and a mutual understanding of the territories that can be explored and the ones that are still raw and require more time. We have talked about Padraig at length, more than I have talked about him with anyone since he passed, and I have found that talking about him brings him back in a way that silence does not, which is a lesson I thought I had already learned with Bridget, but which required learning again with a different person and in a different context, as most important lessons do. I have found that the parts of Padraig I did not know, the parts that Arthur knew, are not foreign to me, but simply the continuation of a person I already understood, the chapters of a book I had read most of, but not all of. Arthur has talked about Eileen in a similar way, about the school she taught in and the children she had taught, some of whom were now adults in the village with children of their own, and about the particular way she had of organizing a kitchen, which was entirely unlike Bridget's way, but equally systematic and equally her own, and about the things he had only fully understood about her after she was gone, which is the particular cruelty of grief, that it so often clarifies what the living of the life alongside someone made difficult to see. He said once, on a Sunday in November when the rain was loud on the kitchen window and Finn was very settled on his mat, and the soup was a good, thick vegetable one, that he thought the thing he missed most about Eileen was not the large things, the events and the occasions and the shared decisions, but the small things, the very small things. The quality of her attention when he was talking to her, the way she held a cup with both hands, even in summer, the particular sound of her in the other room when he was reading, the sound of someone in the other room. He said that was the one he had not expected to miss so specifically, and that it had surprised him by being, in many ways, the hardest one. I told him I knew exactly what he meant, which was true. And we sat with that for a while in the comfortable way that people sit with hard truths when they are no longer alone with them. I want to come to you directly now, before I go on to the end, because we are close to the end, and I want to make sure you're still with me. You have given me a remarkable amount of your time tonight, or this afternoon, or this morning, wherever in the day you are, and I do not take that for granted. tell me something in the comments. Tell me what this has stirred in you, if anything. Tell me whether you have had an Arthur Byrne in your life, someone who was present at the edge of things without making themselves known, who you later discovered had been there all along. Or tell me whether you have been an Arthur Byrne for someone, whether you have stood at a fence in the dark and held yourself at the boundary out of a respect that perhaps began to look from the outside like absence. I think more of us have been on one or both sides of that fence than will easily admit it. Write to me. I read the comments carefully, and I am grateful for every one of them. Leave a like if this story has done something to you that you are glad of. Subscribe if you have not, because there is a new story here every single day, and some of them will find you at exactly the moment you needed finding. And share this one if you know someone who is standing at a fence tonight. You might be the person who opens the gate for them. All right, let me take you to the end. Connor came back for Christmas, as he had promised. He stayed for 2 weeks and brought with him the particular energy of a young man who is good at what he does and who has been using himself well, which is a satisfying energy to be around, the energy of someone who has found a right use for the hours of their life. He and Arthur had dinner together at the cottage on Christmas evening, the three of us, and I made the sort of meal that Bridget used to make on Christmas, the goose and the roast potatoes and the pudding at the end, that takes the best part of a month to prepare properly, which I had begun in late November and which turned out well enough that I was not embarrassed by it. We sat at the table until past 9, which is considerably later than I usually sit anywhere, and the conversation ranged across the year and across the years before it, and out into the kind of territory that Christmas evenings with good people and a decent bottle of wine make available, the territory of what matters and what does not, and how you tell the difference. Arthur said at one point, somewhere in the later part of the evening, that he wanted to mark the occasion by saying something that he was not sure he said often enough, which was thank you. He said it plainly, in the direct way of a man who has learned not to waste the opportunities that exist for saying important things, because experience teaches you that such opportunities are not infinite and that the cost of allowing them to pass unused is higher than the discomfort of saying what you mean when the moment presents itself. He said thank you to Connor for having asked me the question that Sunday morning, and thank you to me for having walked out with 2 mugs of tea rather than leaving the question unanswered, and thank you to Bridget, whom he addressed as though she were present, which she was in the way that people are present who are woven into the fabric of a place so thoroughly that the place cannot be fully understood without them. He said that he had not expected, at this point in his life, to find himself at a table like this, in company like this, with the feeling that he was somewhere he was supposed to be. There are moments in a long life when the accumulation of all the loss and the effort and the years of not knowing whether any of it was adding up to anything that mattered arrives at a single point of clarity, like light through a lens. And for a second, or perhaps longer, you can see what the whole of it was for. I had one of those moments sitting at my kitchen table on Christmas evening, listening to Arthur Byrne say thank you to a woman who had been gone for 4 years, and who had, nonetheless, through the particular invisible architecture of the kindness she had practiced quietly across 4 decades of her life, arranged for this evening to happen. I will not pretend I did not need a moment to collect myself. I did. I took the moment, and then I poured the wine, and we went on. Let me tell you about the gate now, because the gate deserves its own telling. In the months since I hung it, it has become a thing with a character of its own in the way that well-made things develop character through use. The iron hinges have settled perfectly, and it swings without effort and closes with the small, clean click of a good latch finding its catch, a sound I find disproportionately satisfying. For a grown man, but then I have always been a man who takes the well-functioning of a well-made thing seriously. The oak of the uprights has silvered slightly in the weather, which is what good oak does and which I was expecting, and which looks right, which is to say it looks like something that belongs to this place and this fence and this particular corner of Wicklow, rather than something recently purchased and installed. In another 10 years, it will look as though it has always been there. In another 40, it will look as though it could not have been otherwise. I have found, in the months since I built it, that I think about the gate in a particular way. Not as a modification to the fence, which is the practical description of what it is, but as a statement about how I want to live in the time I have remaining to me, which is the deeper description of what it is. I'm 74 years old, and I have built walls and pointed joints and reset lintels and made boundaries that were meant to stand for 100 years. And all of that work was good work, and I'm proud of it. And all of it was also, in some fundamental sense, work in the service of keeping things separate. A wall says here and there. A fence says mine and yours. That is not wrong. Boundaries are necessary. They distribute weight, and they keep the water out, and they define where one thing ends and another begins, and these are necessary facts about the world. But a gate is something else. A gate is the acknowledgement that a boundary is also a threshold, that the place where one thing ends and another begins is also the place where one thing can pass into another, where the field and the cottage garden can exist in their distinction, and yet be continuous in the way that distinct things can be continuous when someone builds the right passage between them. I built a gate because Bridget told a man the gate was not locked, and I believed her. That is as simple and as complicated as it is. In the years that Bridget was doing the quiet things she did, the letters and the visits and the words that mattered and the management of a welcome that extended to people she saw were in need of it, I was building walls. I was out on the various sites of County Wicklow and beyond, working the stone, doing the thing I knew how to do, providing the material stability that our life required. I did not know about the letters in the box. I did not know about Arthur standing at the fence. I did not know the full dimensions of what she was doing. At the same time, I was doing what I was doing. Because she did not tell me, and she did not tell me because she did not believe it required telling, and perhaps also because she understood that I was, in those years, still more fluent in stone than in the language she was speaking, the language of invisible kindness, offered without the expectation of acknowledgement. I am more fluent in it now. A man does not lose his wife of 41 years and live through the following years alone in a stone cottage in Wicklow without learning something about what matters and what does not, and what the difference looks like when you are standing inside it rather than outside it. I have spent 4 years learning the language she was speaking. And the gate is my best sentence in it so far. An oak gate with good iron hinges in the corner of a fence I built with my brother's help in the summer of 1983. Not locked, as it has never been locked, as she said. Let me stop here and give you one more moment before the end, because I think you have earned it, and so have I. If you are still with me after everything we have walked through together in this story, then you are the kind of person who stays with things, who does not leave when the pace slows or the subject asks something of you. That is a quality worth having and worth knowing you have. Tell me in the comments that you are still here. Tell me where you are in the world and what the light looks like where you're sitting. Leave a like if this story has reached the place in you that it was trying to reach. Subscribe because there is a new story here every day, and the next one is already waiting. And if this one moved something in you that you think someone else needs to have moved, share it. You do not know who is sitting in the dark tonight looking at a fence and wondering if the gate is unlocked. You might be the person who tells them it is. All right. This is the last part, and I want to give it the weight it deserves. Arthur came through the gate last Sunday in the February rain, which was the particular persistent kind that Wicklow produces in February. The kind that is not dramatic, but that has no intention of stopping. The kind that gets into everything eventually if you stand in it long enough. He had his good coat on and his good boots and the particular expression of a man who has walked through February rain to get somewhere he genuinely wanted to be, and regards the rain as irrelevant to the importance of the destination. Finn was at the gate before I heard the latch, which is how it always is, Finn's ears being considerably more reliable than mine at this point in our respective careers. We had the soup, which was leek and potato again because we were back in the leek and potato months, and because there is a comfort in the return of a seasonal thing that is more than the sum of its ingredients. We had the bread, which I make on Saturday mornings now, a plain soda bread that turns out reliably well enough that I have stopped being nervous about it, which has taken me 4 years to achieve and which I consider a genuine accomplishment. We talked about the weather and about the state of the domain wall at Rathnew, which Arthur had walked past in the week and which he reported was holding up well against the winter, which gratified me. We talked about Connor's most recent project, which was a walled garden restoration in County Meath, that he had sent me photographs of, and that looked very fine. We talked about Padraig, as we usually do, because there is always something more to say about him, some angle that presents itself fresh in the week between Sundays. We talked about what February means to each of us, which is a conversation we have now because we have both learned that February is a month that requires talking about rather than enduring in silence. Near the end of the afternoon, when the rain had eased slightly and the light was beginning to go, Arthur stood to take his coat from the hook and I stood with him, as I always do, and we went to the back door together the way we have come to do, because there is a few minutes of conversation that happens in the doorway that does not happen at the table, the kind of conversation that takes place at the threshold, in the particular honesty of departure. He stood in the doorway with his coat on and looked out at the gate in the fence corner, which was visible across the garden in the gray February light, the oak upright silver in the wet air, the iron hinges dark and settled. He said, and I want to give you the exact words because they are the words I will carry with me the longest. He said, "She would have been glad of this, I think." He meant Bridget. He meant the gate, and the Sundays and the soup and the whole of what had come from the thermos cap on the fence rail and from Connor's careful question at the breakfast table on a wet Sunday morning. He meant all of it. She would have been glad of this. I told him I was quite sure she was. He said good night and went through the door and across the garden and through the gate with the clean click of the latch finding its catch. I watched him cross the Brennan field in the February dark until I could not see him any more. Finn sat beside me in the doorway for a moment and then went back to his mat, and I closed the door against the cold and stood in the kitchen for a while with the smell of the soup and the bread and the particular warmth of a room that has had people in it who were glad to be there. She would have been glad of this. I think she is. Let me tell you what I have learned from all of it. Not as a list, not as a set of conclusions arrived at in an orderly fashion, but as one thing said plainly by a man who has been turning it over in his hands for a year and who thinks he has found the grain of it. The people who matter most to us are not always the ones who make the most noise about mattering. Bridget did not make noise. She kept a box of letters from a man she had helped in the years when help was what he needed, and she told him the gate was not locked, and she moved on to the next thing without requiring that any of this be known or celebrated or returned. She did this because she understood something that takes most of us a considerable portion of a lifetime to understand, which is that the keeping of kindness private is not the diminishing of it, but the purifying of it. A kindness performed in the expectation of acknowledgement is not entirely a kindness. It is, in part, a transaction. A kindness performed in the full expectation of being known only to the one who gives it and the one who receives it is something closer to what kindness actually is, which is the simple decision to help because help is available and because someone needs it and because you happen to be in a position to provide it. Bridget was in a position to provide it. She provided it. She kept no record of having done so except in a wooden box on the top shelf of a wardrobe where she presumably intended it to stay. The only reason I know about any of it is because a man stood at my fence in the dark for long enough that my grandson noticed and asked me a careful question, and I had the sense to walk out with 2 mugs of tea instead of drawing the curtain. Which is perhaps the second thing I have learned, which is that the right response to the presence of someone at your fence in the dark is generally not to draw the curtain. It is generally to walk out with tea. I have also learned something about the nature of boundaries and what they are for. I spent most of my working life building them. Stone walls, boundary fences, retaining walls, the whole vocabulary of separation and definition that is the trade of a stone mason. And all of that work is good and necessary, and the world would be in a poor state without people who knew how to do it properly. But I had perhaps come to think of the boundary as the destination, as the point, when in fact the boundary is only the frame. The gate is the point. The gate is where the boundary acknowledges what it otherwise refuses to acknowledge, which is that the people on one side of it are the same kind of creature as the people on the other side, and that the wall or fence between them is a practical convenience, and not a statement of fundamental separateness. A gate built into a fence is the fence saying, this is where you are and this is where I am, and between those two true things there is a passage. Come through it if you need to. The latch is on your side, the choice is yours. But know that the passage is there. The gate I built into the fence on the Glenelly Road in Ashford, County Wicklow, is the practical work of a stone mason who learned something late in life. It is made of oak and iron, and it will last 100 years in any weather. It was built to hold something open that should always have been open, which is the welcome that my wife extended to a man who needed it, and which she left behind for me to find and to honor after she was gone. I found it. I honored it as best I could. The gate is the proof. Some of the most important people in your life are not the ones who arrive loudly at the front door with an announcement and an occasion. They are the ones who are quietly present at the edge of things, who come when they are needed and keep their distance when they are not, and who carry their care for you in a way that does not require you to carry it back. They are the ones who stand at the fence in the dark because they do not want to impose, and who wait until someone walks out to tell them that the gate was never locked, that it has never been locked, that all they ever needed to do was lift the latch. Look for those people. They are harder to see than the ones who make noise about being present. But they are there. They are standing at the fence. They are driving slowly past the road. They are writing letters they are not sure they should send. They are waiting to see if someone will notice them before they venture closer. Notice them. Walk out to them with something warm in your hands and something simple on your lips. Tell them the gate is not locked. Because the gate is not locked. It has never been locked. And someone, somewhere near you right now, is waiting in the dark to be told so. Bridget told a man that, and it took 4 years after her death, and a thermos cap on a fence rail for me to find out about it. I do not consider those years wasted. I consider them the time the mortar needed to set. But I would ask you not to wait that long if you can help it. The people at your fence are there now, and the tea is on the hob. And the February evening is cold in Wicklow and cold wherever you are. And there is very little in this life that cannot be improved by the simple act of opening a gate that was never locked and saying plainly, without ceremony, come in out of the cold. Now, before I go, I want to ask you one last thing, and it is the most important ask I will make. If you have been with me for this whole story, if you have sat with Declan and Connor and Arthur and Bridget and Finn and the gate and the fence and the Sunday soups and the February rain from the beginning to where we are right now, then I want you to leave me one word in the comments. One word only. The word is gate. Not because I told you to write it, though I am telling you to write it, but because only the people who actually stayed, who sat with this all the way through, will understand why that particular word is the right one. Only the people who walked this road with me will feel the weight of that word and know what it is holding. Leave Gate in the comments if you are one of those people. That is my ask. Subscribe if you have not yet done so, because there is a new story here every single day, and the one that is waiting for you tomorrow was made with the same care and the same intention as this one. Every one of them carries something true inside it, something worth sitting with, something you can take away and use in the living of your life. That is the only thing I have ever wanted these stories to do. Leave a like, because it is the thing that tells me to keep going, and I want to keep going, and I need to know you are out there. Share this one if you know someone who is standing at a fence tonight. Not because you can explain to them why they need to hear it, simply because you know they do. Send it. Let them find their own way to the word gate. Let them find their own gate. Tell me where you are in the world. Tell me what the evening looks like from where you're sitting. Tell me if you have a Bridget in your life, or if you have been a Bridget for someone, or if you are the one at the fence and you have not yet been found. I want to know. I keep the comments the way Bridget kept the box, carefully and with the understanding that everything in it matters. From my kitchen on the Glenealy Road in Ashford, County Wicklow, with Finn on his mat and the gate in the corner of the fence and the last of the February light going out over the hills, I want to thank you for listening, for staying, for being the kind of person who sits with a story all the way to the end and lets it work on you the way it was trying to work on you. That is not a small thing. That is a form of courage that does not get talked about enough. The courage of staying present for something difficult and true until it becomes, as it always does in the end, something warm. Take care of each other out there. Leave the gate open, and do not forget, the latch has always been on your side.